Well, good morning and welcome back to Genesis class. We've been kind of working our way a little bit slowly through these first few chapters, and I think it's very important that we take our time through especially these first 11 chapters of Genesis. As we talked about way in the very beginning of this class, when we talked about why study Genesis, we talked about how many of the core doctrines of our faith can be found within these first 11 chapters. We've already seen the origin of sin and God's initiation of His plan for the redemption of mankind. We've seen the institution of marriage being set forth. We've seen sin and how it has affected mankind and how all mankind has received a sin nature because of Adam and Eve's initial rebellion against God. We've seen Satan and how he is a real person. He's not just some imaginary figmentation of evil that mankind has come up with to give a face to things they don't understand. But he is an actual person. He is an actual angel. And so we've seen all these different things, and we've just recently been studying the worldwide flood and how God used it to wipe out all of life on the earth, save for Noah, his family, and the animals that were on the ark. And we talk about this worldwide flood, and we emphasized it because so many people in today's world try to take the geological features that they see that we as Christians understand would have most likely been formed by the flood, and they try to attach millions and billions of years of formation to those things. I didn't dwell on it very long. I was more interested in looking at the spiritual applications of the worldwide flood and God's punishment of mankind. But I think it's important that we pause for a moment and remember that we still see the scars of the worldwide flood on this earth to this day. We are daily digging up fossils of things that were buried those thousands of years ago. And I find it interesting that I was reading in a journal, a scientific journal at one point. As a kid, I was fascinated with archaeology and paleontology. And one of the things that they mentioned with a lot of these fossils that they dig up is that a lot of them show evidence of extreme physical trauma right before they were fossilized. You see, evolution tells us that a lot of this fossilization took a long period of time over millions of years, but a lot of these fossils show that these deaths were not peaceful deaths. Their bones are contorted in interesting in shapes, indicating severe trauma before burial. And I think that should be an indicator that the Bible is accurate when it speaks of a worldwide flood. After all, being hit with several tons of water right before being buried by sand would be quite a bit of physical trauma. And so we also looked at, when we talked about this flood, that it was God who shut Noah and his family in the ark. Noah did not seal the fate of mankind. God did. And then it started with the fountains of the deep breaking apart and the windows of heaven being opened and rain being seen possibly for the first time since the creation of the world. There's 40 days and 40 nights of this rain. And then about 1 year after God shuts Noah into the ark, the land starts to dry. Noah's able to open up the ark. He sends out the two birds to see if it's okay for him and his family to get out. And when the dove no longer returns, him and his family and the animals leave. And so now we left Noah and his family on the mountain where it had settled. We're not 100% sure exactly where it is, just because it simply says the mountains of Ararat, although the Turkish government seems to think that they know the exact location, and there's possibly some evidence that it could be actually on Mount Ararat in Turkey, but no one's been really able to go up there and confirm it. So we leave Noah and his family on the side of the mountain. They've just exited. All the animals have exited. Everything went forth out of the ark. And we're going to be in Genesis chapter 8. We're going to start in verses 20 through 22. Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remaineth, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And so we see as soon as Noah and his family get off the ark, they make many sacrifices, and they build this altar unto the Lord. It says he took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl. So he took of the sheep, of the goats, of the cattle, of the pigeons, and these other animals that God would later codify in the book of Leviticus as being clean, and he offers them all up as burnt offerings on an altar that he builds, indicating that he still has God foremost in his mind. Now, burnt offerings were typically for the cleansing of sin. You had the burnt offerings and the sin offerings in the book of Leviticus that were offered. They could also be offered as thanksgiving. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why Noah here could be sacrificing. And I think all of them make sense. Certainly he is thankful that him and his family were spared from this catastrophe. I mean, the waters have not been off the face of the earth for very long. I'm sure there is still destruction as far as the eye can see. If you go to a place where there's been a lot of flooding, that devastation can last for quite some time. I remember as a child, I lived in North Dakota, and almost right before we moved to Grand Forks, North Dakota, one of the rivers had flooded its banks and wiped out a considerable part of the downtown area. And I remember we came there about a year or 2 years after that event happened, and you could still see some of the devastation. They were still cleaning up, and that was not a very big flood. So I can imagine the waters having just dried up, that Noah walks out and there's just devastation everywhere. And I'm sure in his heart he is quite thankful for the fact that God spared him and his family. And I'm sure seeing that devastation also reminded him of the reason why it had happened. Man's heart had been evil continually. There had been so much sin that God saw fit to essentially almost start over. And so Noah offers these sacrifices to God, I'm sure, for both of those reasons. So what are some of the consequences of this? Because notice it says he offers them on the altar, and then it says the Lord smells a sweet savor. And I like that it points that out, because God does not forget our sacrifices. Now, we don't offer animal sacrifices as the Israelite people did anymore. But in Romans 12 it talks about offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. And God knows of the sacrifices that we make. It's not that we have to try to somehow get God's attention. In a lot of the Far Eastern religions, there's often a lot of noise making to try to attract the attention of the spirit world or of their deities. And they try to make all this racket to try to get their attention, similar to, I think, back to Elijah when he was facing down the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And they're dancing around their altar, making all kinds of noise and cutting themselves, trying to get Baal's attention. We don't need to go to such extreme lengths to get God's attention. He hears us, and he knows of the things, of the sacrifices that we make for him. And so God sees, and it says he smells Noah's sacrifice, and God then says that he would no longer curse the ground anymore for man's sake. The ground has essentially been cursed 3 times at this point. It was cursed once for Adam. When he sinned, the ground would not produce as easily anymore. It was cursed a second time for Cain's murder, when God cursed Cain and said that the ground would no longer grow for him. Okay, so that was the second time the ground was cursed. And then it was cursed a third time when God destroyed the world in a flood. And so God says, I'm not going to curse the ground anymore. And we'll see later when he is actually talking to Noah, because he's not talking to Noah at this point. We'll see when he talks to Noah, he is specifically referring to destroying the ground, destroying the earth with water again. But nonetheless, I can see that there are some parallels to some of the other punishments that God gave out. God would not smite all living creatures again, as he did with the flood. And then also, he would allow time to progress normally as long as the earth lasts. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Now sure, there were some times where things would be altered ever so slightly. When Joshua took the Israelites into the promised land and they were fighting, I can't remember against whom off the top of my head, but God stopped the sun for a time to allow Israel to finish their victory. And then again with Hezekiah when he turned time backwards a few hours to show his power. So there are times where God has certainly influenced time, but he has not and will not ever prevent these things from happening as long as, the key here is, as long as the earth lasts. And this ought to be a comfort to us. This is often a verse that is used when we talk about climate change. We talk about things such as global warming or global cooling, and how mankind's influence upon the environment is going to cause great devastation. But the fact of the matter is that God is perfectly capable of upkeeping the planet, and while I ought to do my part to not wreak havoc, as we saw in Genesis chapter 2, in Genesis 1 and 2, with the dominion mandate, I ought to take care of what God has given me. I ought to exercise good stewardship. I do not need to fear that there will come a point where there will not be a harvest. I do not need to fear a time where there will be only winter or only summer, because God promised that as long as the earth remained, these things would come. And so yes, there have been times of great famine where the harvest was not able to be, due to different reasons, the harvest was not as great or as plenteous, and things happened. I think of the Irish potato famine or the Dust Bowl in the 1920s and the 1800s. I think of times throughout the Bible, throughout the scriptures, where it talks about there being no rain and there being a great drought, or the 7 years of famine with Egypt. But nonetheless, in spite of these natural disasters, some of them caused by God, it always went back to normal. God always brought things back to a state of balance where there was, again, seed time and harvest and things like that. So God makes that promise in his heart. And so then we come to Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. And at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. So God then talks to Noah, and he establishes a covenant with Noah. And as he does so, he gives some new instructions for mankind. Previous to this, mankind had been, it seems mankind had been vegan, vegetarian perhaps. They did not eat meat. And so they would have tended flocks and herds for things like milk, for wool, for sacrifices, things like that. But it seems that prior to this point, mankind at least was not in the habit of eating meat. Perhaps that might have been one of the things that those violent things that perhaps pre-flood man had been doing. We don't know for sure, but it seems after this point, God tells Noah it's okay to eat meat. And scientists have speculated why perhaps this was. If you prescribe to the idea that the earth had been previously protected by a heavier atmosphere, now that this heavier atmosphere is gone because of the windows of heaven being opened, suddenly the sun's radiation is now more strong upon the earth, and it is more destructive to the skin, which God gave us to protect us from the sun's harmful rays. And in order to replenish those skin cells more quickly, more protein would need to be eaten. It is known that those who follow a vegetarian and a vegan diet have to be very careful about making sure that they get enough plant-based protein, because if they don't, that can lead to deficiency diseases. So perhaps that's one of the reasons. Perhaps the other reason is the fact that after the flood, you are going to see lifespans shorten incredibly quickly as people start living from 900 years and then going down to 100 years over what seems to be a relatively short period of time. And so perhaps this change in diet was essential because as the sin curse was taking more and more of a hold on man's physical body, that physical death was becoming more and more strong, mankind would need new sources of nutrients in order to be able to even survive. Whatever the reasons may be, God then gives Noah this permission to eat meat. He also tells them to replenish the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. All mankind had been wiped out. They needed to replenish the earth. Because of this new permission to eat meat, animals would now be afraid of man. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon the fishes of the sea. Where previously it had been relatively easy for mankind to take care of the animals because that had been man's command. Now, animals are going to be afraid of man. And it is true in nature that pretty much across the board, predator and otherwise, there is a natural fear of man. Now, there are sometimes exceptions to this. In the what is it? I believe it's the Field Museum. There's the skin or the taxidermied body of a lion that killed, I want to say, dozens of people in Africa for seemingly no reason that they could determine. It wasn't hunting for food, at least if I'm recalling the story correctly. It just killed humans for sport. And that lion had been killed. So every once in a while there are exceptions to the rule, but the vast majority of animals, including predators, try to avoid man. They try to stay away from man. They will usually flee if they sense a human approaching. I tell my students, as a science teacher, I get to the privilege of talking about ocean life, and we talk about sharks. And we talk about how the vast majority of shark attacks are not because the shark wants to eat a human. It usually mistakes the human for something else, and as soon as it bites down and realizes, wait a second, this isn't what I thought, it leaves. The unfortunate fact is the shark's mouth is so big that usually the first bite is enough to kill a person. But usually when a shark attacks a person, it's not actually attacking it as a human being. There's a case of mistaken identity. And as soon as it recognizes its mistake, it will usually not finish off what it started. It will usually swim off because there is this instinct against harming or against a familiarity with humans. And we have been able to domesticate some animals, but it requires a lot of effort to be able to do so a lot of times. And it usually requires being with the animal from birth in order to get it to overcome its natural instinct and fear for mankind. The key with the eating here of the meat, though, I talked about this, I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But what God specifically mandates here is to eat meat, but to eat it without the blood. They were to drain the blood of the animal before they were to eat it. And here's why it says, the flesh with the life thereof. They were not allowed to eat the blood because the blood represented life. And this is why we have two understandings of what a living thing is. We say that plants live because they grow, they reproduce, and things like that. But plants do not have life biblically because they do not have blood. And throughout the scriptures, we see blood over and over and over again being used to represent life. And it is for the reason that blood represents life that the New Testament says that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Because we understand from Romans that the wages of sin is death. It is the removal of life. And so if you do not remove the blood, if the thing does not have blood, it does not have what we think of as biblical life. And that's why we have throughout, especially in the Greek, there are several different words for life to represent, just general things that grow, such as plants and things like that. And then there's another word for life that represents things that have blood. And if you're wondering on camera why I keep motioning this way when we talk about plants, there's a window over here with trees. So if you're watching by way of video, and just imagine over here there's windows with trees, and that's why I keep motioning that direction when we talk about plants. And so God says, look, you can eat meat, that's fine, but make sure the life has been drained from it. And again, there is scientific reason for this. Okay, God does not say things for no reason. There is always some kind of reason throughout the scripture for why God says to do certain things and not to do other things. And it is very true that diseases often reside in the bloodstream of a creature. Our blood is full of all of the waste material from cellular respiration, from the burning of nutrients within our cells. Those waste products go into the blood, where then they are filtered out through the kidneys. There are often bacteria within the blood that the white blood cells are destroying and bringing out. And so to consume blood would be to consume all of those waste products, all of that bacteria, all of that cellular waste, which would then be bad for a human being. We understand the concept of blood-borne diseases. As when I worked as a janitor, we had to spend probably a good several hours learning how to specifically clean up blood messes, blood spills. Because you couldn't just treat it like you would treat, say, a spill of soda, when someone would knock over a soda on a shelf or something like that, or anything like that. If it was blood, it had to be treated with special care, because we scientifically now know their blood is quite filthy as far as bacteria and viruses and other pathogens go. And so you had to be well protected. You were wearing 2 or more layers of gloves. You were usually wearing some kind of splash shield to prevent any from hitting your face. You would sometimes, depending on how big the spill was, you might even have to put on special shoe coverings to keep your shoes from getting the bacteria on it, or from getting the blood on it. So later on, if you touched your shoe, you wouldn't be touching the blood. And we treat we treat blood spills very, very carefully, because we understand a lot of nasty diseases can come out of the blood. But back then, the world had just been devastated by flood. Scientific advancement had completely halted. I don't think Noah knew everything there was to know on the face of the planet. I don't think he was some kind of Superman as far as his brain was concerned. He just spent the last 120 years building a boat and preaching the gospel, preaching salvation through the building of this ark. And so God here says, look, don't eat the blood. He doesn't explain why. He just says, don't do it. And modern science has caught up, and now we understand. This is why God commanded this, and why God would command it over and over again. But he just simply says, don't do it, because that's the life. But in doing this, he was also protecting them. Also in this, mankind's life is given a value. Mankind's life is given a value. And this is one of the great things about our faith. This is one of the great things about God's Word, is that it treats human life as essentially priceless. Where other faiths categorize humans into lesser humans and more valuable humans, where they treat genders with different with different levels rather than as equal, where in other religions children are treated with contempt. The Bible is very clear that all human life has value. I'll read it again. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. The value is that every human being on the face of the planet is made in God's image. And so because of that, mankind has inestimable value. The only proper way to pay for the shedding of blood is to have that person's own blood shed. We call this the law of capital punishment. Law of capital punishment. Where if a human being, or even an animal, okay, it talks about in verse 5, even if an animal is to kill a human, that animal is to lose its life as well. When I was a child, actually, when I was a baby, I was probably maybe a few months old. My parents told me about a time where one night they were sleeping and they heard a child crying. My dad heard a child crying. And down the street, they had this neighbor who had constantly been told by the police that their dog needed to be chained. That a fence was not enough, the dog was too violent, the dog needed to be chained. They had been told this repeatedly and repeatedly ignored the police's warning. And it just so happened that night a child had been walking by and the dog had jumped the fence and was chasing this child down the street with the intention of mauling the child. So my dad, without hesitating, without thinking, he grabbed his spearfishing gun, went and shot the dog, and felt no remorse. The neighbor tried to sue, and they were told, you were told multiple times, your dog was violent, you needed to chain your dog. What this man has done is he has saved a child's life. You ought to be thanking him that your dog didn't kill the child, because you'd have been going to jail. And we understand that when an animal kills a human being, that animal ought to be put down, which baffles the mind as to why a few years ago we got all uptight over an animal killing a child, and then that animal was put down, and everyone cared more about the animal than they did for the child that was killed. Yeah. It shows the denigration of our society, where we care more about this animal, about this gorilla that basically destroyed a child's body that had fallen into the pit, into the display, and we care about that more than we cared about the life of the child. And I think that just goes to show that as a society we have started to devalue the life of a human. Throughout, in many other cultures, they have there is already a devaluing of human life, where other religions teach the concept of honor killings, that it's okay to kill a person for certain reasons just simply because it offends family honor, or things like that. And we here in America are starting to see that devaluing of human life, where God is very clear. If a human life is taken, and we understand this to mean, because we'll see later on as we read through the book of Genesis, and if you were to study Exodus and onwards, we're not talking here about, for example, someone defending themselves. God will create laws later on for someone who is defending themselves in fear of their life. God here is not talking about war, although certainly war is not a part of God's plan. But what we are talking here is a situation similar to that of Cain and Abel, where you have the shedding of innocent blood, where what we are talking about here is a man killing another man for no other reason than simply because he desires to do so. And God says that man or that animal needs to die. And so we have the law of capital punishment. And we also say that this is the beginning of government, because someone would have to take care of these cases that would come up. If someone killed another man, there would have to be another body, another authority to be able to execute this judgment. Romans 13 talks about how the government was given by God to be a sword against those who would do evil, to be a fear to those who would do evil. And so here we see another beginning. Okay, again, Genesis is the book of beginnings. We have here another beginning. We have the institution of government through the passing of this law of capital punishment. As we move on, 8 through 17, God then gives a promise to Noah. And he establishes a covenant. In verse 8 it says, God spake unto Noah with his son, saying, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. This is a nice and easy covenant to figure out who it's for. Everybody comes from Noah. Everyone is descended from Noah because Noah was the only person left on the planet, Noah and his family. So this is a nice and easy covenant to figure out, well, who is this promise for? Because there's a lot of debate sometimes about these different covenants and who they are specifically intended to be for. Well, this one's easy. Anyone who's a descendant of Noah is an inheritor of this covenant. And since every human being comes from Noah, all of us are inheritors of this covenant. With every living creature that is with you, of the fowl of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth, and I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. Again, this covenant has no end. It will just keep going on and on and on throughout the generations of Noah. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. So God then establishes this covenant with all of Noah's descendants. That means all of us who are in this room, all of you who are watching, anyone on earth is an inheritor of this covenant. God would no more destroy the earth, and the key here is by the waters of a flood. God is going to destroy the earth again one day, but it will be by fire. It will not be by water. He would no longer destroy all life by flood. And again, another stipulation here is all life. We still have floods. I've been reading some articles on the recent hurricanes down in the Gulf because my parents kind of live in that area. Fortunately, they're further away from the ocean, so they don't have to worry too much about storm surge and things like that. But there's a lot of flooding in some of these places because of the sheer amount of rain, and I'm sure there is destruction of life. I'm sure there have been people who have died, and certainly animals that have died, but it is by no means anywhere close to all flesh. And so God is careful here to say that. If God had just simply said that there will no more be floods, well then that would make the Bible's not true, because we still see floods today. But he's very clear that, first of all, the earth would not be destroyed by the waters of a flood, and that all flesh would not be destroyed by a flood. And even if we were to look in the book of Revelation at when God remakes the heaven and the earth, we know that God is not going to destroy all flesh, because those of us who are believers will be taken out of it. We will be taken away. We will not be a part of that destruction. We will not be cast into the lake of fire. We will not be a part of the destruction of the earth. And so even then, God fulfills his promise even beyond just the waters of the flood. He's not going to destroy all flesh. He's going to take those who follow him out of that destruction. and then to kind of just remind mankind of this promise that he made. He said, I'm going to put a visual sign. It's a lot easier for the human brain to remember something visual. Sometimes for fun, as I teach, I'll draw little pictures for my history class, illustrating some of the details that they need to remember for some kind of graded material. Because the human brain is much more easily cognitive, and it grasps and holds on to pictures more easily than it does to words. And so God gives a picture and says, look, this bow, this rainbow that I'm going to put in the sky, this is the sign of my promise. Whenever it rains, depending on where you are in relation to the sun, scientifically speaking, this rainbow will appear. And that was God's sign. Now, and this is one of the other verses that people like to use to say that before the flood there was no rain. And I could certainly see where they would come up with this. Because if it had rained before the flood, then people would have seen a rainbow before. But if the earth had only misted from the ground, there would have been iridescence, sure, that multicolored spray that we can sometimes see coming from the ground or from a waterfall or things like that. But the idea of a rainbow in the sky, if it had never rained before, this would be a completely new thing for mankind to experience. And unfortunately, we're seeing the taking of the symbol and it being used to represent certain other things that are wrong and that are against God's word. But initially, this rainbow was given as a token saying, hey, look, I will not destroy the earth anymore by water. Now, if the chapter had just ended there, that would have been a nice high note to end on. God has made a promise, he's given a token of this promise, and mankind lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, that's not how the chapter ends. It keeps going, and it talks about the generations of Noah in verses 18 through 19. But we're going to go ahead and move to verse 20. Noah began to be an husbandman. He started to cultivate the earth. That was his job. He had to grow food. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And he planted a vineyard to grow grapes. Again, nothing wrong with that. Grapes are delicious. I like eating them. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, and laid it upon their shoulders, and went backwards, and covered the nakedness of their fathers, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So unfortunately, sin has not gone away. Noah is not a perfect being, and I think that's the reason why this is included. In addition to the curse that's put on Canaan, which we will see throughout Scripture being fulfilled as the descendants of Shem, the Israelite people, and as the descendants of Japheth, those who would eventually become the northern peoples, the Europeans and the Asians, will often have dominion and control over the land of Canaan. So Noah plants a vineyard. There's nothing wrong with that. He then gets drunk off of this wine. Some say that Noah did not know that his grape juice would turn into wine. Given the state of mankind before the flood, I think they pretty much knew how fermentation worked. My guess is that this was intentional. I could be wrong. He could have just been making grape juice, and I had a roommate who left grape juice under the bed for 3 months and then drank it later only to find out that it had fermented. So it is entirely possible that perhaps Noah didn't know what was going on here. But again, these are not unintelligent people. I think he fully knew well what he was doing. There seems to be no indication that he was caught by surprise by being drunk. Especially given the fact that he doesn't own up to his mistake. Ham exposes his father. Ham walks in, sees his father, and goes out and talks to his brothers. given Noah's very strong reaction to what happens later on, I don't think this was Ham just going to his brothers and saying, "Hey, Dad's drunk and passed out in his tent. Don't go in there." I think very likely that he was probably either making fun of his father, or some think that he humiliated his father while he was passed out. Anyway, something serious goes on here. So Shem and Japheth go in. They cover their father, and when Noah wakes up, he understands, he knows what Ham did to him, or said about him, okay? So whatever humiliation that Ham did to his father, Noah catches wind of it, either by hearing it from Shem and Japheth, or by seeing what was done to himself, and so he then curses Ham by cursing Canaan specifically. Why specifically curse Canaan, I'm not sure. Perhaps it was because Ham was already older, and so cursing Ham would have done nothing to teach Ham a lesson. So perhaps he curses Canaan for it. Later on, God will tell the Israelites that a father's sin would not pass down, or the punishment of a father's sin could be, passed down from generations up to 3 generations. So perhaps this is why. But nonetheless, he curses Ham by cursing Canaan and telling Canaan that he would be a servant. As you read through the Old Testament, you see time and time again the Canaanites being subjected by other nations. First, the nation of Israel is told to completely wipe them out. The Israelites do not do so, but then throughout history, empire after empire would come in and would rule over Canaan. Canaan would never be its own independent land, and so, I would believe, if you could trace certain heritages back, perhaps that is even still the case today, where those who are descendant of Canaan have no rights over their own property. They have no rights over their own land. They are the servants of others. And then unfortunately, death is still a thing. God, yes, has punished mankind for their sin, but man still has a sin nature. Noah still has a sin nature. And so, Noah lives for 950 years and then he dies. Just like every other man after him would do, until Jesus Christ. And so, the story does not end happily, but now mankind has a chance for a fresh start. And we're going to look at, next time, how mankind does not learn their lesson. That within a few generations, they're already back to rebelling against God. That even though the flood was still fresh in the minds of these people, even though they could still have the first-hand accounts from their forefathers, they immediately go back to rebelling. So we'll talk about that next week. Thanks for your attention, thanks for your attendance, and we'll see you next time.